This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. When Jerry Goldsmith's Oscar-winning operatic score kicks in during the opening moments of The Omen, you immediately know doom is inevitable. It is a ferociously hair-raising mood setter that soon became synonymous with evil bastard children, and for good reason. The Omen is a story in which we fear innocence, whereas later horrors, especially by Stephen King, played heavily into the trope of killing kids in fiction being grossly taboo despite their naive perception of invincibility. The Omen contorted that concept long before, with a diabolically evil child whose only real match was that little shithead from that one Twilight Zone episode. The Omen tells the story of an American diplomat called Robert Thorne, who adopts a baby boy following the death of his own newborn, whom he calls Damien. Years later, after moving to England to become the UK's American ambassador, Robert and his wife Kathy soon begin to experience strange and disturbing occurrences surrounding Damien, with Robert being confronted by a paranoid priest who warns Robert that Damien is in fact the Antichrist and must be destroyed before Satan can return to Earth. Here's the thing, The Omen later became a highly influential horror in pop culture, and has since been referenced and parodied to death in some of the most popular media out there, so there is no way in hell you haven't at least heard the premise in some capacity. However, like with most 70s horror flicks without persistent franchises, nobody ever talks about it these days. As such, since it is Halloween, now is no better time to reintroduce a cult classic, completely lost to this generation of rapid and vapid media consumption. Like with the Amityville Horror, The Omen and its collective trilogy have had a haunting, but dare I say, somewhat disappointing place in horror cinema iconography. Yet without it, there's a strong possibility we would never have had that defining signature template for evil, creepy children. I'm looking at you, Children of the Corn. As always, as we go along, please leave your thoughts in the comments below, including recommendations for what I should cover in the future. And lastly, here are a few words from this video sponsor, ExpressVPN. While Halloween is the greatest time of year, I understand for many horror fans, it's becoming difficult to quench that horror movie thirst as you run out of choices on your favorite streaming services. However, did you know that ExpressVPN allows you to select from dozens of locations around the world, and with a simple smash of a button, you can unlock a wide variety of films and television shows not accessible on streaming services in your country. For example, if you're in America and switch to a UK server, you can use Disney Plus to watch the entire OMEN Trilogy that I'm about to cover, and afterwards, if you're still starved, you can switch over to Disney Plus Australia, which has access to the 2006 remake. Personally, this month I've been using ExpressVPN to access Shudder US because there are a plethora of cult films unavailable in the UK version, such as Dario Argento's Opera and Itchy the Killer. For me, streaming services are an expensive commodity and time is precious, so you're goddamn right I'm going to get the most I can out of what I'm rightfully paying for. Without ExpressVPN, it's like going to the gym and only being allowed to use the treadmill. Just give me everything. So if you want to unlock the full potential of services like Disney Plus, Netflix, Shudder, and so on, ExpressVPN is the app that you need today. And heck, don't just take my word for it, there are countless positive reviews to go through. Find out how you can get 3 months free by clicking the link below or visiting expressvpn.com/Ryan. So, I imagine the word disappointing probably provoked a few comments from die-hard Omen fans, so I'm going to start there before we get into the finer details of the story. Broadly speaking, I largely enjoyed the first film. It's a decent Friday night chiller. In fact, I would go as far as to call it the original Final Destination for how it goes about killing off each character with its eerie, supernatural, macabre undertones. However, taken as a collective trilogy, the 1976 original is effectively an origin story that's all set up and no outcome, with the sequels just simply not living up to the apocalyptic prophecy that's mysteriously insinuated in the first film. The way I see it, the films have the issue of being underwritten as opposed to badly written. All the key crescendos are there, but its delivery relies heavily on taking shortcuts that expect you to just go along with it. As such, a lot of the story comes down to characters just suddenly realizing what's going on without any substance or logic on how they came to that conclusion, which does undermine some of the genuinely startling revelations. Now, with that said, there's no obligation to watch the sequels unless you want the full canon conclusion, as the original was technically written with an ambiguous cliffhanger in mind to reinforce its brooding sense of doom. It still works as a self-contained, irreverent horror flick much like Brightburn, which is basically a 21st century version of the same story, except one major detail that might surprise many of you is just how little screen time Damien actually has in the film. It's like what I was saying about Pinhead and the Cenobites in my Hellraiser video. The Omen is all hyped around this murderous, wicked entity and all of its abilities, yet it's much more about the individuals caught in the crossfire of something potentially bigger than them. That's why I would say The Omen has more in common with Rosemary's Baby than it does The Exorcist, which The Omen still takes many stylistic ideas from, given it was the juggernaut of the era when it released 3 years before it. The Omen is practically more about the parents, specifically the father, than it is about Damien. As a result, I would like to think the movie has a greater haunting impact on parents because the concept of your cute, sweet, adorable child secretly being a demonic, scheming, murderous thug is probably your worst nightmare. I mean, you could get into the whole metaphor of nature versus nurture, as Damien is established as different from the beginning, especially considering he's an adopted child instead of one that's made of Robert and Kathy's own flesh and blood. However, this isn't that type of movie. It's ultimately a very simple doomsday premise that, at most, maybe makes you question whether or not Damien is in fact evil. This is where I think the cliffhanger might divide people, because during the development, director Richard Donner and writer David Zeltzer conflicted over just how ambiguous the story ought to be. Donner wanted to leave Damien's powers open to interpretation and have the deaths merely be perceived as bizarre freak accidents, whereas Zeltzer and subsequently producer Harvey Bernard very adamantly wanted Damien to unquestionably be the Antichrist, which is exactly what's conveyed to us in the final few seconds. As such, while Damien's behaviour is minimalistic enough to make him a constant question mark, there's no real misdirection, twists or turns to suggest otherwise due to the precise vision of its writer, so in my opinion, the ending isn't as provocative as it could have been. Anyway, moving on to the film's events, what truly sets the tone for the story is when during Damien's 5th birthday, all the happy screams and cheers come to a jarring halt when his nanny hangs herself in front of everyone, seemingly upon his request, with a mean-mugging Rottweiler arriving to serve as a literal sinister hellhound to protect him. Soon after, many questions and startling circumstances start surmounting, such as the origins of the new nanny called Mrs. Baylock, who the Thorns don't remember hiring, but she's allowed to stay anyway, making me question the Thorns' own parenting instincts. Damien then begins acting erratic and terrified when approaching a church, less so signaling his satanic origins, and more so behaving like every child forced to attend church, with his weirdness really beginning to show when terrifying a bunch of animals at a safari park, like when a kid, or well, grown adult, scares away pigeons on the street. It all starts to make sense when a deranged priest called Brennan desperately attempts to explain Damien's origins to Robert, telling him that he must locate a special set of daggers that are the only means in which to kill him. However, it's when a photographer called Keith Jennings enters the picture does the terrifying reality of the situation intensify the urgency. Jennings reveals that his photographs develop with mysterious shadows that are discovered to be foreshadowing the deaths of the subject, such as a line through Father Brennan, who is killed by a pole impaled through his chest. Yeah, it's essentially the same concept taken by Final Destination 3. You see, this is the thing about all the kills throughout the series. They're either presented as accidents or circumstantial. Nothing about them is technically out of the ordinary, except maybe their bizarre timing, hence why I call the Omen the OG Final Destination. They also have similar atmospheric qualities. They're quiet and chilling with occasional bursts of violence along the way. It fits better to say it's thriller territory than strictly horror. There's a looming presence of death and frailty that's just soaked so deeply into the autumn setting. You really do get the vibe that something shadowy and cursed is encompassing Damien. It's off-putting without needing to be direct about it. It's not so much Damien we fear as we do the indestructible omnipotent force that prevents anyone from standing in his way. From this point, I'm going to enter into spoiler territory for the ending and the 2 sequels that continue Damien's story, so if you're curious to check it out, obviously you know what to do, and for everyone else, brace yourself. Following the bizarre death of Father Brennan, Robert teams up with Jennings to track down Damien's origins in Rome. Upon returning to the hospital where Damien was given to Robert, they learn that a fire broke out shortly after their departure, destroying Damien's records. They then confront the ailing priest who gave Robert the baby, who guides them to a cemetery where Damien's mother is supposedly buried, and upon exhuming the grave, both men find a jackal buried in her place, alongside the skeletal remains of another baby buried next to it. That baby happens to be Robert's original child, who was murdered so Damien could take his place in the home of someone with power. It's a compelling justification for making Damien's father a politician. Since we learn that Damien is looking to reign supreme on Earth, he's now able to infiltrate through pre-existing power, calling upon one character's notion that politics is the inevitable route to conflict and turmoil. However, things continue to grow even more sinister when Robert realizes that the jackal is actually Damien's true mother, which according to Graham Hunt of the Catholic Church's Dominican Order, can be symbolized as an animal that preys upon the weak or defenseless creature it encounters, to scavenge among the refuse or crops of mankind. It was renowned for devouring the dead. The jackal waits and watches, and when the time is opportune and the risk slight, he pounces. His aim is survival. Basically, it's the epitome of a thoughtless wild predator that exists only to consume and will do everything and anything in its power to survive, which is what Damien ultimately does. It really does help accentuate both the wicked and otherworldliness. At this point, any idea that Damien is even remotely human is straight out the fucking window. He's like the devil disguised as a snake in the Garden of Eden. He's dressed up to look innocent, but he's something else beneath all that. Robert and Jennings then meet with a religious archaeologist called Carl, who gives Robert the daggers that are said to be the only weapons that can kill the beast, soon leading to Jennings losing his head because we gotta get rid of his character somehow. Really, his death is part of the whole omnipotence of evil. Everyone that even merely mentions that Damien is evil or pose any threat to him is killed. Kathy is then murdered by the nanny after Damien's failed attempt to do the same, and upon dragging his bastard child to the church to end this evil once and for all, the cops arrive and shoot Robert dead. It's a very nihilistic ending. The last 20 minutes essentially establish just how urgent the whole matter truly is. It's an impending doomsday apocalypse that we're too late to stop, and the world is completely unaware of it. The point the ending makes, in which Damien is now in the care of the US president during his parents' funeral, fulfills the ultimate prophecy. Damien is now under the greatest protection possible. His reign is certainly inevitable. However, just as inevitably, along came the sequels to take what was a very pivotal ending and convert it into something, ironically, a little bit soulless. So let's briefly talk about parts 2 and 3, bearing in mind that both these sequels are nearly 2 hours each, which is quite a lot for something that really doesn't have a lot of plot to it. One way to characterize the sequel is to consider it an attempt to give Damien more of a personality during his preteen years, only to retread the exact same ground again while upping the Final Destination style kill count. We open with the archaeologist Carl dying in a cave-in, thus disposing of the last remaining witness to Damien's evil, only for it to mean very little when the daggers eventually end up in the possession of Dr. Charles Warren, the curator of the Thorn Museum, which is owned by the late Robert's brother Richard, who is now Damien's guardian. Frankly, it is an absolute slog of a sequel. Once again, Damien is barely the focus of the story, with much of the runtime devoted to Robert's surviving family, who we never learn anything about in the original. You can definitely tell they forced the plot into existence because it doesn't seamlessly connect in a meaningful way, but I do appreciate the noble intentions to at least explore the position of power Damien is slowly getting himself into. The main focus surrounds Richard's energy-producing chemical factory as it experiences managerial conflict. The junior manager Paul proposes moving focus into agriculture, which comes under moral scrutiny by senior management, who explain the threat chemical production and expansion poses to the indigenous population. It's a very specific plot detail, but the point of it is essentially chemicals, capitalism, environmental destruction, bad, bad, bad. Take that very real-world issue and connect it with the satanic doomsday apocalypse, and you kinda see where it's going with it. Paul starts attempting to mentor Damien into taking over the factory one day. Thus you see how this evil little shit is being conditioned into power and authority, along with his military school training that sees him taking charge of his powers. All the pieces are being put into place. Damien's innocence is effectively eroding away, and you're seeing him slowly embrace who or what he truly is, eventually being fully consumed by evil after murdering his best friend and cousin Mark under the threat his satanic origins will be exposed. In other words, Damien becomes the jackal that he is. Hell, he even has the bone marrow off a jackal, in case the symbolism wasn't exactly clear already. The outcome is pretty much the same as the first film. Richard attempts to use the daggers on Damien, who's now pimping it out like a demonic playboy, but Richard's wife is revealed to be a disciple of Damien's and in turn kills Richard, allowing Damien to advance closer to Doomsday. Now, part 3, I would argue, is somewhat of an improvement, as it does try to tie everything together up to this point. The problem, however, is that it ends with more of a whimper than the bang that it builds itself up to be. The final conflict, as it's called, now sees Damien as a grown adult, following in the footsteps of his, fathers. In one shoe, he's Satan's little shithead, and in the other, he ends up becoming the UK's new American ambassador, like Robert once was, following the suicide of the previous ambassador that mirrors the death of Damien's original nanny. The urgency established in the second half of the original is reintroduced, as Damien discovers that the return of his father may be disrupted if the second coming of Jesus occurs, as the constellations imply. In what should not be funny but is, this time Damien's threat comes in the form of a ragtag team of rogue priests who obtain the daggers in a bid to destroy the Prince of Darkness once and for all. However, if Damien's omnipotence throughout the trilogy has shown us anything, it's that this all ends up being a pointless endeavor, as the priests fumble their execution so excruciatingly bad as they effortlessly get killed off one by Damien, who this time chooses to face his haters head on. Now, to its credit, Damien actually has a legitimate character this time thanks to Sam Neill's reliable performance. There is a sense of insecurity from Damien, who up to this point has been in total control of his destiny, yet the second coming becomes his antithetical equivalent. At the same time, Damien does maintain a commanding presence as a cool business tycoon of sorts, as he creates a following of disciples to do his devilish bidding. That is, during the second Star of Bethlehem, he has his disciples murder every newborn boy so Jesus cannot return. It's a genuinely despicable scene that somehow reminded me of the baptism scene from The Godfather, and once it's over, Damien ends up having to confront his trusted subordinate, mirroring his conflicted killing killing of his cousin Mark in part 2, whose newborn son is discovered to be the final surviving vessel. By the way, the priest angle is long out of the film by this point. There is one surviving priest who basically convinces Damien's new girlfriend Kate to lure him out to get stabbed by the final dagger, only for Damien to use her son as a fucking meat shield, so yeah, worst assassin priests ever, let's say? Anyway, it ends up being Kate who kills Damien, bringing all this doomsday build-up to a bitter end, which I find unsatisfying because I actually wanted Damien to win in the end, because thematically you could argue that The Omen is about the nihilism of evil. It's a trilogy about chaos and destruction with no real significant purpose. It sticks heavily to the fire and brimstone of wrathful interpretations of the Bible. Hell is just this unthinkable abomination. However, part of me thinks that by robbing Damien of that destiny, you give him a taste of his own medicine. He survives long enough to see his efforts mean nothing. A dagger in his back surrounded by the ruins of a church he despises are a perfect symbolic gesture as he succumbs to what is effectively a mere mortal death. And that is The Omen. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Yes, I am aware there is a fourth unrelated film, I have not seen it, and there is a 2006 remake starring Ray Donovan, which in my opinion is a bit too try-hard. I always recommend the original over the remake purely because it has such a rich October atmosphere to it. So until next time, stay safe, stay away from evil children, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye!